The palace stood tall against the bright morning sky, its walls shining as if history itself was carved into every stone. People gathered outside the main gates, where two royal guards stood motionless in their deep-colored uniforms, hats pulled low, eyes fixed straight ahead. For tourists and visitors, the guards were almost like statues. They did not move, did not speak, and did not show even the smallest change of expression. Some people whispered that they were trained like machines, but in truth every guard was human, carrying stories, feelings, and lives that remained unseen behind their duty. That morning the crowd was thicker than usual. Families had come from different towns to see the palace, and the air was filled with laughter, the clicks of cameras, and children pointing in amazement. People admired the guards, taking pictures, sometimes standing right beside them to see if they would react. But no matter what happened, the guards kept their posture strong. Their silence was both mysterious and powerful. It was a silence that made everyone respect them, even if some tried to test their discipline. Among the visitors was a little boy, no older than 7. His eyes sparkled with mischief, and he carried a balloon in one hand while tugging on his mother's sleeve with the other. "Mama, look, they don't even blink," he said in a loud voice that drew chuckles from nearby tourists. His mother smiled softly and reminded him, "They are doing their job. They are not supposed to move." But the boy was determined. He wanted to see if he could make the guard laugh. He stepped closer, standing on his tiptoes to match the guard's tall boots. With a cheeky grin, he made a funny face, sticking out his tongue and crossing his eyes. People around him laughed, whispering, "He's trying so hard." The boy clapped his hands loudly, then hopped in circles, trying every trick he knew. The guard did not flinch. His jaw remained set, his eyes steady, his posture perfect. The silence of the guards was like an invisible wall between them and the outside world. The boy's father, embarrassed but amused, called out, "All right, come back now. Don't bother him." But the boy pouted, waving his balloon in front of the guard's face. "Why won't you smile?" he asked, his innocent voice carrying above the chatter of the crowd. Still, there was no answer. The guard's eyes looked past him as if the boy was invisible. People began to giggle, some taking videos, knowing that these guards never reacted no matter what. In that moment, the boy gave up. He sighed loudly, dragging his balloon back to his parents, and said with exaggerated disappointment, "They really are statues." His words caused more laughter, but also a certain admiration. The guards were unshaken. Their silence, though puzzling to some, created a sense of awe. It was not rudeness, it was duty, and in their duty, they carried the weight of tradition that had lasted for centuries. As the morning went on, more and more people gathered. Tourists posed, couples took pictures, and guides explained the long history of the palace. The guards stood there through it all, their stillness a symbol of strength. Yet behind their silence, behind their serious faces, lived real human beings with hearts that could feel joy, sorrow, and compassion. No one thought about that, though. To the crowd, the guards were only symbols. And symbols were not supposed to break. The air was filled with excitement because that day was no ordinary day. The palace was preparing for a celebration that would draw even more attention. Flags waved in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, musicians practiced their notes for the afternoon parade. The guards, however, remained unchanged. Whether it was a normal weekday or the grandest of events, their task was the same: to stand tall, to protect, and to remain silent. Every now and then, a person in the crowd would wonder quietly to themselves, what are they thinking? Do they ever want to laugh? Do they get tired? These questions, however, were never answered. The silence of the guards was stronger than curiosity. It was part of their honor. It was their identity. But not everyone was content with silence. Some tourists whispered jokes. Others dared each other to shout funny phrases. One man waved his hat wildly in front of a guard's face, hoping for even a blink. A group of teenagers tried humming songs near the guards, watching closely for any reaction. Nothing worked. Their efforts turned into playful laughter, but once again the guards stood untouched. For many, this silence became a mystery worth remembering. People went home telling stories about how unshakable the guards were. They carried with them the memory of a tradition that seemed impossible to break. Yet for one guard standing at the gate, the silence felt heavier than usual. He had worn the uniform for many years, and he had grown used to the curious eyes of the crowd. Still, every now and then, he longed for a moment when people would understand that he was more than just a silent figure. He was a man with a family, with dreams, with memories of childhood laughter. He remembered when he, too, had once been a little boy who tried to make a soldier smile. That memory lived inside him, even as he stood frozen in his role. He knew the world expected him to be a symbol, but deep down he was human. And being human meant that silence was sometimes the hardest part of his duty. As the sun climbed higher, the light reflected off the polished buttons of their uniforms. The crowd shifted, making room for new visitors. The guards continued their watch, unblinking, unshaken. People left with photographs, videos, and laughter. But the silent figures remained, like guardians not just of the palace, but of an ancient dignity. The boy with the balloon, who had tried so hard earlier, glanced back one last time as his family prepared to leave. He whispered quietly, almost to himself, "Maybe they can smile when no one is watching." His words floated away in the breeze, unheard by the guards, but carrying a truth that many overlooked. Behind their silence was life, and life was never truly empty. No one in the crowd knew it yet, but soon the silence of the guards would be tested in ways no one had ever seen. There would come a day when one guard would step beyond his duty, when silence would no longer be enough. That day would reveal something far greater than discipline. It would reveal the heart hidden inside the uniform. And it would change forever how people remembered the royal guards. The sun had moved higher into the sky, and the palace grounds were now alive with energy. Flags rippled in the breeze, and the crowd outside the gates grew thicker with every passing hour. Families gathered shoulder to shoulder. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders for a better view, and elderly visitors leaned on walking sticks while pointing out the details of the palace walls. Excitement buzzed like electricity in the air because this was not an ordinary day. It was the day of the national celebration, and the people expected parades, music, and perhaps even a glimpse of the Queen herself. The royal guard stood exactly where they had been since morning, unshaken by the commotion. Their stillness seemed even more impressive against the lively background of laughter and chatter. They were the walls of discipline in a sea of movement. Every eye glanced at them at least once, wondering if the guards felt the same thrill as the crowd, though no one dared to ask aloud. The silence of the guards was stronger than the noise around them. In the middle of the crowd, a father carefully pushed a wheelchair that carried his daughter. She was small, no more than 9 years old, with bright eyes that shone with excitement. A bunch of fresh flowers rested on her lap, carefully arranged and tied with a ribbon. She clutched them as if they were her treasure. The girl's dream was simple: to give these flowers to the Queen. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, trimming and arranging the bouquet herself, despite the weakness in her hands. The celebration was her one chance to come close, and she had been waiting eagerly for this day. The father's face was calm, but his eyes revealed the effort behind every push. The crowd was thick, and it was not easy to move the chair through so many people. He whispered gentle words to his daughter as he leaned forward. "Hold tight. We'll get closer." She nodded, her small fingers gripping the flowers even tighter. The closer they moved, the harder it became. The palace gates were a magnet for the crowd, and people pressed forward in hopes of being in the best spot when the Queen appeared. Strangers accidentally blocked the father's way, some too distracted to notice the wheelchair behind them. The girl's hopeful eyes darted around, searching for a path, but it was like trying to cross a river with no bridge. "Excuse me," the father said softly, but his words were swallowed by the noise. People were talking, laughing, and taking pictures. No one meant to be unkind, but their excitement made them unaware. The father tried again, gently tapping one man on the shoulder. The man turned briefly, glanced at the wheelchair, and shifted a little, but the space remained too narrow to move further. The girl tilted her head back, her small voice rising above the crowd. "Please, I just want to see her." Her words were not loud, but they carried a weight that seemed to pause the air around her. A few people nearby turned, their faces softening as they noticed her for the first time. The flowers in her lap trembled slightly in her hands, as though the petals themselves shared her hope. The royal guard stood only a few steps away, their expressions unbroken, their posture firm. But though their faces gave nothing away, they had heard her. The plea of a child carried farther than any other sound. The guard closest to the gate felt something stir inside him, something he had long learned to keep hidden during duty. His training told him to remain still, to remain silent, yet his heart whispered otherwise. The father tried once more to move forward, apologizing softly as he brushed against people in front of him. "Just a little more," he said to his daughter, his voice warm but strained. He wished the world could see her the way he did, brave and determined despite her struggles. But in the sea of celebration, she was just one small voice. The girl's plea seemed to hang in the air unanswered. People nearby looked at the guards, curious if they would break their silence. "They won't," someone whispered. "They never do." Yet still all eyes lingered, waiting as if something unusual might happen. A mother in the crowd leaned down to her own child and pointed toward the girl in the wheelchair. "Look at her," she whispered gently. "She wants to give flowers to the queen." The boy's innocent face softened, and for a moment even he forgot about the excitement of the parade. The crowd's energy began to shift. What had been laughter and noise now settled into quiet expectation. The girl looked straight at the guards, her voice trembling but clear. "Please, I just want to see her." Her father placed a hand over hers, trying to comfort her, though he too wished the world would part to make space. And then, something almost invisible happened. The guard nearest to her shifted slightly. It was no grand movement, but in the stillness of their discipline, even the smallest gesture was thunderous. His eyes, hidden beneath his tall hat, flickered toward the child. To most, it would look like nothing at all. But for those who were watching closely, it was everything. The people around the wheelchair noticed first. Their whispers spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. "Did he just move?" someone murmured. "No, they don't move." Another shook their head, eyes wide. "I think he did." He heard her. The air grew heavy with anticipation. The crowd leaned in as though the world had frozen. The guards, who had never spoken, who had never broken their silence, seemed to stand at the edge of something remarkable. The girl's flowers shook in her lap, her tiny fingers tightening around them as though she, too, sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. The father, standing behind her, felt the stillness press against him. He knew the rules of the guards. He knew they never spoke, and yet in his heart he felt hope rise for the first time that day. Perhaps today would be different. For the moment, however, silence remained. The guards did not move further, their posture still firm. But silence did not mean absence. The girl's words had reached them, and though no one could yet see it, the silence of the guards was being tested in a way that had not happened in years. The crowd did not laugh anymore. They did not tease or try to make the guards react. Instead, they watched with quiet respect, as if they understood that something deeper than tradition was happening before their eyes. The girl in the wheelchair, her bouquet of flowers resting gently against her lap, lifted her face once more toward the guards. Her eyes held no demand, only a simple wish born from innocence and kindness. She did not know if they would answer, but she believed in trying. And in her belief, she unknowingly touched something that had been hidden behind the silence of the palace walls for centuries. No one in the crowd knew what would happen next. But they all sensed it. The moment was building. A child's voice, a father's hope, and the unshakable silence of the guards were about to collide. And when they did, the story of the royal guards would never be the same again. The crowd was frozen in quiet anticipation. The girl's soft plea still hung in the air, carried by the afternoon breeze, and though the music of the distant parade could faintly be heard, it felt as if the world around the palace gates had paused. Every eye was fixed on the guards. Their tall figures, standing as firm as ever, seemed unshakable. Yet something invisible had already shifted. The guard closest to the girl in the wheelchair could feel the weight of her words pressing against his chest. He had spent years in service, trained to remain silent, trained to be still, trained to let no emotion escape. His uniform was not just fabric. It was a symbol of discipline, of loyalty, of honor. To break his silence was to step beyond what the world expected of him. Yet the child's voice had reached a place inside him that duty could not silence. He remembered his own daughter, about the same age as the girl before him, who would sometimes run into his arms when he returned home from duty. She too had bright eyes that shone with hope, and he often promised her that he would always listen, no matter how tired or busy he was. And now, standing here, he saw in this young girl's face the same innocence, the same desire to be seen and heard. The thought pierced through the steel of his training. The girl clutched the flowers tightly, looking at him with eyes that did not demand, only asked. Around her, the crowd was silent. For the first time that day, no one tried to joke, no one tried to test the guards. Instead, all waited with quiet respect. The guard's lips parted ever so slightly. At first, no sound came. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest as though it was reminding him of the weight of his choice. His fellow guards remained still, their eyes locked straight ahead, but he knew they too had heard the girl's words. In their silence, he felt both their discipline and their understanding. Finally, in a voice so soft that only those near could hear, he whispered, "Wait here." It was only 2 words, but it was enough to send ripples through the crowd. A gasp broke the stillness. People blinked in disbelief. The guards were not supposed to speak, everyone knew that. And yet, here it was. A voice from one of them. Not sharp or commanding, but gentle, carrying the weight of compassion. The girl's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. She looked at her father, who stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just heard. Tears began to glisten in his eyes, though he quickly blinked them away. He bent down to his daughter and whispered, "He spoke to you." The crowd began to buzz with whispers, the sound spreading like wind over grass. "Did you hear him?" one man asked in disbelief. "He said something," a woman added, holding her hand to her chest. Cameras that had once been raised only for pictures now recorded the moment. Phones shook in people's hands as they tried to capture what was happening. The guard took a small step forward, his boots echoing softly against the stone ground. To anyone else, it was just a movement, but in the discipline of the guards, it was monumental. He raised one hand slightly and signaled to the crowd. The people instinctively shifted aside, creating space for the girl and her father. It was as though the guard's quiet authority extended beyond words, guiding everyone without a single command. The father hesitated for a moment, unsure if he was truly allowed to move closer, but the guard's small nod assured him. He gently pushed the wheelchair forward, the path now clear. The girl's flowers shook in her lap, not from the wind but from the excitement coursing through her. The closer she came to the gate, the brighter her eyes grew. The guard's voice rose once more, steady this time, though still calm and respectful. "Stay close," he said softly to the father. Again, it was not much, but it was enough to make the crowd fall completely silent. Never before had they witnessed such a thing. The girl looked up at the guard with admiration. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so small that it nearly disappeared in the air. But he heard it, and though his expression remained composed, something gentle stirred in his eyes, something only those near enough could notice. Behind him, the other guards remained in formation, their stillness unbroken. Yet even in their silence, there was an unspoken bond of agreement. They understood why he had stepped forward, why he had broken tradition. Duty was important, but humanity was greater. The father pushed the wheelchair slowly forward until they were near enough to the gate that the child could see the palace steps. The flowers in her lap glowed brightly in the sunlight, a symbol of her simple wish. The crowd stood frozen, their hearts caught in the moment. What had begun as a simple day of celebration had now transformed into a story they would tell for years. The guards, who had always seemed like statues of tradition, were now revealed to be men with hearts, men who could be moved by kindness, by innocence, by the plea of a child. Whispers spread again through the people, softer this time, filled not with shock but with admiration. "He helped her," someone said quietly. "He spoke for her." Another added, "They're not just guards. They're people like us." The girl's father looked up at the guard with gratitude shining in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly, though he knew the guard was not meant to answer. The guard gave the slightest bow of his head, the only response he could offer without betraying his role. The girl, still holding her flowers tightly, gazed at the palace with hope filling her heart. She did not know if the queen would come, but she knew one thing for certain. Her voice had been heard. And for her, that was already a victory. The crowd waited, their breaths held as though expecting more. And though the guard did not speak again, the air remained charged with meaning. Silence had been broken not by rebellion but by compassion, and once silence was broken, it could never be remembered in the same way again. The father leaned down to his daughter and whispered, "See?" He listened. He wanted you to be seen. The girl nodded, her smile soft and full of gratitude. She looked back at the guard one last time, her lips curving into the sweetest thank you that words could never fully express. In that moment, something larger than tradition had been born. The world had witnessed discipline and kindness standing side by side, and the crowd understood that the two did not have to be enemies. The guard had chosen humanity, and in doing so he had not weakened the honor of his post but strengthened it. As the crowd stood in hushed awe, many realized they had just seen history. The royal guards, long known for their silence, had finally shown the world that silence could bend for compassion. And though the event was not yet finished, though more surprises waited ahead, the moment would live on as one of the most heartfelt in memory. The palace gates seemed to shine brighter as the little girl was guided forward. The crowd had parted for her, leaving a clear path where moments ago there had only been a sea of bodies. Every eye followed her as her father gently pushed the wheelchair closer to the tall figure of the royal guard, who had broken centuries of silence. The flowers on her lap trembled softly as she clutched them, her heart beating fast with a mixture of nerves and joy. People around her barely breathed. Some pressed hands over their mouths in disbelief. Others held cameras in shaking hands, but none dared to laugh or make noise now. This was no longer about entertainment or testing the guards. It had become something greater, something sacred. The guard remained tall, his uniform perfect, his hat shadowing his face. Yet there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he was no longer just a silent statue. He was a man who had chosen kindness. His earlier whisper still echoed in people's ears. "Wait here." Now, as the girl reached the front, the air thickened with emotion. What would happen next? Would he return to silence, or would compassion guide him again? The girl tilted her head up, her small hands wrapped tightly around the stems of the flowers. She opened her mouth, her voice faint but steady. "Sir," she whispered, "will the queen see me?" Her father's hand tightened on the wheelchair handles, his throat too tight to speak. The crowd leaned forward as though those simple words had struck a chord in every heart. They all knew the answer should have been silence. Guards did not respond. Guards did not speak. Yet the people waited because they felt that silence had already been broken. For a moment, the guard did not move. His jaw remained set, his eyes straight ahead. But then slowly he lowered his head just enough to look directly at the child. The movement was small, but to those who watched it was monumental. His eyes, often hidden and unreadable, softened with something human, something tender, and then, against all rules of tradition, his deep voice carried once more, this time strong enough for the whole front of the crowd to hear. "You are very brave," he said gently. "The queen will see you." The crowd gasped as though a wave had crashed through them. Some clutched their chests. Others wiped tears before they even realized they were crying. A guard had spoken, not out of duty, not out of command, but out of pure compassion. And he had spoken directly to a child who had only wished to be seen. The girl's eyes widened, sparkling with tears of joy. She covered her mouth with one hand, the flowers pressed tightly to her chest with the other. Her father's eyes filled as he bent closer, whispering, "You heard him. You really did." His voice cracked with emotion, the moment too overwhelming to contain. The guard, still standing tall, then did something that stunned even his fellow soldiers. He stepped out of line fully, breaking formation, and moved toward the girl. Every click of his boots on the stone echoed like thunder in the silence. People whispered, some holding their breath, afraid even to blink. When he reached her, he did the unthinkable. He bent down, lowering himself to her level. The tall figure of discipline, usually towering above the crowd, now knelt in front of a small child in a wheelchair. His gloved hands rested lightly on his knees, his eyes meeting hers without the shadow of his hat to hide them. For the first time, the girl saw him not as a guard, but as a person. "You carried these flowers with such care," he said, his voice quiet but filled with warmth. "She will be honored to receive them from you." The girl's lips trembled. "Really?" she whispered. The guard gave the faintest smile, so subtle it could have been missed, but to her it was brighter than the sun. "Really," he replied. The crowd erupted in soft applause. It wasn't loud, not the kind of clapping that belonged to festivals or parades. It was gentle, respectful, the kind of sound that carried tears more than cheers. Strangers reached for each other's hands. Mothers hugged their children closer, and fathers lifted sons and daughters onto their shoulders to witness a moment that would be remembered for generations. The father bowed his head, overwhelmed by gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You don't know what this means to her. To us." The guard did not respond with words this time. He simply placed a hand gently over his heart, a gesture of sincerity that spoke louder than anything else. Then, rising slowly, he turned toward the palace steps. With a single nod, he signaled to another guard at the gate. The second guard, understanding without words, moved quickly and disappeared through the gates toward the palace. The crowd whispered in awe. Everyone knew what this meant. The queen would be informed. The flowers would be received. The little girl's dream was about to come true. The girl clutched the bouquet to her chest, her eyes following the guard who had spoken to her. To her, he was no longer just a man in uniform. He was her hero. Minutes passed like hours. The crowd grew restless, not with impatience but with anticipation. The air seemed charged with energy, as though the very stones of the palace walls were waiting. And then the gate slowly opened again. The second guard reappeared, standing taller than before. His voice, clear and formal, echoed across the crowd. "Her Majesty will see the child." The crowd gasped, their whispers bursting into astonished cries. People clapped, others wiped tears, and children squealed with delight. The girl's father bent down to her, his voice trembling as he said, "Do you hear that? She's going to see you." The girl's hands trembled as she hugged the flowers close. "She will see me," she repeated softly, her voice filled with wonder. The first guard, still standing near her, leaned slightly forward once more. His words, though brief, carried a weight that filled every corner of the square. "Be proud," he told her softly. "You are making history today." The girl's smile glowed like sunlight, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. She looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you for speaking to me." And though the guard could not abandon his role entirely, though his expression soon returned to the stillness of duty, the world had already seen what mattered most. In that moment, he was not just a royal guard. He was the voice of kindness, the symbol of compassion and the heart of humanity hidden behind tradition. The crowd erupted again, not with noise but with emotion. Strangers hugged, parents lifted their children high, and people whispered to one another that they had witnessed the day the royal guards broke their silence. The girl's father pushed her forward toward the gates, the path clear as if the whole world had stepped aside. The guards on duty did not stop her, for the command had already been given. She was no longer just a visitor, she was a guest of honor. The flowers in her lap seemed to glow brighter, the petals opening as though they too were alive with joy. The little girl looked back once more at the guard who had knelt before her. Her eyes spoke the words she could not find, gratitude deeper than language, love stronger than silence, and the guard, though he could not speak again, gave the faintest nod, a promise that he would remember her forever. The palace square, once filled with chatter and laughter, had been transformed. Silence had been broken, not by noise or demand, but by the simplest act of kindness, and in that silence broken, a new kind of respect had been born, not just for the guards, but for the humanity within them. The palace gates slowly closed behind the girl and her father, as they disappeared into the grand halls beyond. The crowd that had gathered outside remained frozen in place as if time itself had paused to honor the moment. People looked at one another, their eyes wide with disbelief, their hearts touched by what they had just witnessed. A royal guard had spoken, had stepped forward, had knelt, and because of his compassion, a little girl's dream was coming true. For years, tourists had visited the palace to see the guards, to laugh at their stillness, to marvel at their discipline, but now all anyone could think about was the sound of his voice, soft yet firm, telling the girl she was brave, telling her that she would be seen. The whispers spread quickly, carried from one person to another. "Did you hear it?" He spoke. He broke the silence. The guard himself made way for her. Some people were already on their phones sending messages to loved ones. Videos began to circulate almost immediately. By the time the sun began to dip lower in the sky, clips of the guard kneeling to the little girl were spreading beyond the palace square, reaching homes and hearts across the country. The silence of the guards, once considered unbreakable, had been broken, and in doing so, something beautiful had been revealed. Inside the palace, the girl was guided down corridors of marble and gold. Her father's hands trembled on the wheelchair handles, not from weakness but from the overwhelming nature of the moment. He whispered words of encouragement, telling her how proud he was, how this day would never be forgotten. The girl clutched her bouquet of flowers, holding them as if they were the key to her dream. When the queen finally appeared, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown, her warm smile lit up the room. She knelt beside the little girl, accepting the flowers with both hands. "Thank you, my dear," the queen said softly. "These are beautiful. And so are you, for having the courage to bring them to me." Tears rolled down the father's face as he bowed his head. The girl's eyes sparkled brighter than the jewels in the palace walls. For her, the moment felt like magic. Back outside the gates, the guard who had broken his silence returned to his position. His expression was once again composed, his posture tall and proud. But though his face showed discipline, his heart was forever changed. He knew that people were whispering, recording, and watching him more closely than ever before. Yet he did not regret a single thing. For the first time in his career, he had stepped beyond tradition and shown the world that compassion was not weakness but strength. The crowd slowly began to disperse as word spread that the girl had been received by the queen herself. Parents held their children's hands tightly, whispering that they must always remember this day. Strangers shared smiles and handshakes, united by the feeling that they had been part of history. What had started as a normal celebration had become a story of humanity and kindness that would echo far beyond the palace walls. By evening, the news channels carried the story. Headlines appeared on screens. Royal Guard breaks silence for child's dream. A tradition of silence gives way to compassion. Commentators praised the moment, calling it one of the most heartfelt events the nation had seen in decades. Reporters described how the Guard's simple act had reminded the world that even in the strictest duties, there is room for kindness. The father and daughter returned home with hearts overflowing. The girl placed the ribbon from her flowers on her nightstand, promising herself she would never forget the day the queen smiled at her, or the day the Guard spoke for her. Her father tucked her in that night, whispering, "You made them listen, my brave one. You showed them all the power of hope." As for the Guard, his life continued in uniform. Day after day he stood at his post, silent once more, unshaken, his face unreadable. Tourists still came, laughing and whispering, trying to test the Guards as they always had. But something was different now. When people looked at him, they no longer saw only a statue of discipline. They saw the man who had spoken, the man who had knelt, the man who had listened to a child. His silence now carried a story, one that people told with respect instead of curiosity. Parents would point to him and tell their children, "That is the Guard who made a little girl's dream come true." Children, holding their parents' hands, looked at him with awe, whispering that maybe, just maybe, the Guards weren't statues after all. They were people, people with hearts as strong as their duty. In the years that followed, the story grew into legend. Schools used it as a lesson, teaching children that courage can be found in the smallest voices and that compassion can come even from the strictest roles. Artists painted the moment of the kneeling Guard and the little girl with her flowers. Writers described it as the day tradition met humanity. For generations, the story continued to be told, not just as history but as inspiration. The girl grew older, but she never forgot. Every time she passed the palace in later years, she would glance toward the Guards and remember the one who had bent down to her, the one who had listened. And though she never knew his name, he lived forever in her heart as her hero. The Guard himself never sought fame. He never gave interviews, never broke his silence again in public. But those who served alongside him knew that he carried the moment within him always. They said that sometimes when he stood in formation and children laughed nearby, his eyes softened just a little, not enough to break discipline, but enough to show that the man beneath the uniform had not forgotten the child who once made him speak. The palace gates remained a place of tradition, but the memory of that day lingered. Visitors who had not even been there told the story to new generations. And as time passed, the lesson of that day grew clearer. Silence can be powerful, but compassion is stronger. Rules may guide us, but humanity gives them meaning. In the end, the moment became more than just an event. It became a legacy. A child with flowers, a father's hope, a Guard's compassion, and a queen's smile. All of it combined to remind the world that beneath every uniform, every tradition, every duty, there is a human heart. And so, the Royal Guards continued their watch, standing tall and silent. But they were no longer seen as unreachable figures. They were remembered as men and women who, when the time was right, could break their silence in the most heartfelt way. The crowd that had once laughed now looked with respect. The tourists who once tested the Guards now told their children the story. And the girl who had once whispered for help carried the memory like a crown upon her life. The day the Guard spoke was no longer just a moment. It was a reminder to the world that kindness, no matter how small, can change history.